It's 2023, and as we move toward the first quarter of the 21st century, we're reassessing many of the systems we rely on. An area we return to in popular conversation sooner or later is the notion of education, and particularly of schooling. What we were taught in school often faces scrutiny, or perhaps more vigorously, what we weren't taught in school, and why on earth we weren't taught this or that or the other. Implicit in that conversation about the substance and nature of the knowledge that we are inducted into is the school's relationship to the society in which it sits. Implicit is the notion that the school is in some way, shape, or form making citizens. Perhaps not wholly or completely. Clearly there are enormous influences upon every young person beyond the classroom. But significantly, the school is where a culture crystallizes the knowledge that it believes to be capital W worthwhile. Classrooms are the most complex social space society has for this reason. The central activity of the classroom is cultivating in young people the habits and knowledge that we believe, apparently, best prepare them to become a potentially productive citizen and, hopefully, a flourishing human being. So as society changes, as we begin to turn that first corner of this century, that question of preparation, that question of whether or not a system remains fit for purpose becomes sharper and sharper. And society is changing. It's quite clear that liberal democracies are having to flex and strain under the novel pressures of the 21st century. Internet-connected technologies carry with them complex challenges and opportunities. Our now default state of connectedness and all the contradictions that we've come to understand that term to embody opens up new categories for our personal and collective futures. It's perhaps more important than ever, then, that education, and specifically schooling, positions every individual to function and participate in the public life of a social democracy. How then to do so? What principles could we adopt for educational reform? If there are new categories to negotiate with, what new tools could schools provide to its citizens to be? Politics, the marketplace, learners themselves offer suggestions. Ideas like oracy, compulsory maths, technical and social skills. All competing ideas and none without merit. I'm going to offer one of my own. It's one that's a little less technically palpable, perhaps, but it's one that I believe is inextricably linked to our capacity to participate in the public life of a 21st century social democracy. I'm going to talk about the imagination. The imagination. Now, in the English language, the imagination is a loaded term, isn't it? If something is imaginary, then it is fantastical. It's fictive. It is inherently unreal. Something imaginary is weightless and insubstantial, perhaps even disposable and frivolous, childish even, in its most damning description. But I believe we must renew our understanding of the imagination in the context of education, and we must think about how it works in a society. Historically, philosophical thought on the imagination has been at an impasse between individual faculty and social context. On the one hand, Greek and Enlightenment thinking wants to characterize the imagination as an innate faculty, residing solely within the mind of the individual that is then applied to the raw material of the exterior world. And on the other hand, psychoanalytic and structuralist thinking wants to argue that what we call imaginary is not an innate faculty, but instead resides solely in exterior social context, and therefore depends upon experience and social connection. On the one hand, the imagination as individual faculty, and on the other, the imaginary social context. Contemporary philosopher Chiara Battici wants to propose a theory for the imagination that moves past this impasse, to propose a third state. She calls that third state the imaginal. The imaginal. And she argues that it consists of imagery. Let's leave that there for a moment. Step back and try out an example to see if we can observe where the imaginal might function. Consider ancient Athens. Picture it. Consider its highways and its byways, its places of government and commerce, its homes and communities, places of public gathering and celebration. A distinct place and space enlivened by its residents. If, in a moment, we were to click our fingers and remove all the Athenians themselves, whisk them away, somehow, to some empty place, far removed. Healthy, life and limb preserved, but far removed, never to return. Leaving behind empty streets, vacant homes, plazas, transport systems, drinking houses, businesses and theatres, all vacant, all empty. Athens without its Athenians. Where now is Athens? Is Athens this crowd of stranded people, removed from any sense of place or space, with no streets or homes or habits to indicate Athens? Or is it the empty streets left behind? Is it these vacant homes and lonely monuments, with no Athenian left to observe or practice or live out Athens? If this were a classroom, now is the point where I'd have you discuss this idea. But what I hope this illustrates is that in this argument, neither of these things is Athens. Athens can be neither the people nor the place in isolation. Athens is neither entirely the imagination as individual faculty, nor entirely the imaginary social context. And if neither of these things is Athens, then the thing we call Athens is imagined, somewhere between individual and context. Athens is that third state. Athens is imaginal. The thing we call Athens arises from somewhere within the dialogue between the individual Athenian and Athens, the context. The theory of the imaginal therefore tells us that the act of imagining is centrally involved in the public democratic life of a citizen. The act of imagining is what allows the Athenians to go beyond themselves and imagine commonalities, beyond their status as a collection of individuals to function as a community. Why then is this act of imagining of particular importance to us in 2023? Why should we position the imagination as a guiding principle for educational reform? In our contemporary conditions, in the heavily technologized public political space that young people are being educated into, we are experiencing a uniquely modern phenomenon. We are becoming oversaturated with imagery. Young people in particular are inundated with images of themselves, of one another, and of the possibilities of action and choice. Internet-connected technologies have seen a massive quantitative increase in the abundance of imagery in our everyday lives. And with that quantitative increase, there comes a qualitative shift. With more images in more areas of our public and private lives, images play a more significant role in making sense of ourselves and one another. Now, that idea, particularly in the context of young people, is not new. There has been much discussion around the impact that social media and screen exposure and the images these carry have had upon the well-being of young people. But I think we can take that argument one step further and consider how this state of oversaturation shapes not just our private selves, but our public selves. Ourselves as a community, ourselves as a social democracy. And we can do that because the act of imagining that I am arguing for here, that the imagination is the capacity with which we go beyond ourselves, inhabit one another's perspective, find commonalities, and ultimately function as a community, that act of imagining depends significantly upon imagery. The theory of the imaginal wants to argue that images function as the currency of our imagination, that images are the substance with which we imagine, and therefore trade the possibilities of action and choice. I think we can recognize intuitively that our capacity to imagine is bound up with imagery. Earlier, I asked you to imagine Athens, and I expect you produced some mental image. Perhaps you can also see y equals x squared, or you possess a particular image of school, or community, or British. Indeed, I think it would happen even without your say-so. If I said to you, whatever you do, do not imagine a purple penguin, I expect you can all see him. If I said to you, whatever you do, do not please imagine that he's wearing a fabulous little bow tie, well, I think it's nice he made the effort, isn't it? So, if our imaginations use images to function, and if our imaginations are the capacity with which we go beyond ourselves, then there is a risk. There is a risk in this massive overabundance of imagery we experience in our contemporary conditions. Our imaginations become simultaneously overburdened and undernourished. We risk losing the capacity to go beyond what is and imagine for ourselves different images, new alternatives for our personal and collective futures. How then could education respond? What does an education for imagination look like? Well, as disappointing as it might be, I'm going to maintain there isn't the scope here for me to answer that question schematically. I could talk an awful lot more, but for now, I will maintain that an education for imagination will prioritize certain qualities. If our imagination is our capacity for going beyond ourselves, for intervening into the world, for functioning as a community, then an education for imagination will prioritize a state of critical inquiry, a state in which learners come to recognize and confront the imaginary parameters of tradition and name alternatives. Learners must be educated. Young people must be educated, not just to give good answers, but to ask good questions. Briefly, I'd just like to make room for a sense of neurodiversity. Clearly, not everyone will use images in their thinking as I have wanted to understand them here this evening. Indeed, no one's cognitive landscape will be exactly the same as anyone else's, and isn't that a wonderful thing? But I just think that means there is further fascinating conversation to be had around this. What I've tried to bring out this evening is that whether you know it or not, whether you acknowledge it or not, you are, in your capacity as a social democratic citizen, simultaneously imagining and being imagined. We exist in that third, imaginal state. If we don't credit that, then the onrush of imageries in our contemporary conditions will readily spill into that space we call possibility. The risk is not that our imaginations will be repressed. If we do not educate for the imagination, the risk is that our imaginations will be outsourced, that your imaginings of yourself and others will be done for you. Thank you.